Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the Bee's Knees by the Big Cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 3, Day 8. But first, let's do our daily punishment. The Middle Ages were called the Dark Ages because there were too many nights. Key terms for today: deism, Thomas Paine, Unitarians, the Oneida community, Shakers, the Second Great Awakening, Charles Finney, Peter Cartwright, Joseph Smith, the American Temperance Society, William Laud, Carrie Nation, the WCTU, Susan B. Anthony, yeah, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, yeah, Seneca Falls Convention, Dorothea Dix, Horace Mann, William McGuffey, Noah Webster, the Hudson River Valley Art, and Transcendentalist. We're going to go over the causes and effects of the Second Great Awakening, the reform movements during the Second Great Awakening, and artistic and cultural changes in this time period. So this time period is spanning around early 1800s until like 1850s. And America is going to go through the Second Great Awakening. We already talked about the First Great Awakening before, but America is going to have a Second Great Awakening. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the state of American religion in the early 1800s. As you remember, some of the founding fathers were deists. They didn't believe in original sin. Some of the founding fathers did not believe in a personal God. They didn't believe Christ was divine. They more just focused on the teachings of Christ. Thomas Jefferson is a good example of a deist. Thomas Jefferson actually rewrote the Bible because he knows more, evidently. And he's going to get rid of all the miracles of Jesus and just keep his phrases because he thought Jesus was a pretty wise dude. Thomas Paine is going to write a book. He's the one that did Common Sense, but he also writes a book called The Age of Reason that basically argues that all churches were meant to set up and terrify and enslave all of mankind. There will be a new Christian religion that will be formed. It's called Unitarians. It starts in England but comes to America. Unitarians believed that God existed in one person. They did not believe in the Holy Trinity. They did not believe that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit were one God. They focused on the goodness of human nature. They thought you could be saved through good works. So they're very much against the whole Calvinist idea of our Puritan forefathers. There will be utopian communities being formed during this time. We have the Oneida community. The Oneida community was a group of people. They lived in a farm area together. They practiced birth control, which is a new idea. They lived together. They shared property. They were known for making steel traps, which they would sell. You also have the Shakers, which is a new religion being formed. The Shakers were led by Mother Ann Lee, and how you knew they were Shakers is they would shake when the Holy Spirit came to them, supposedly. Shake from the Holy Spirit. There's some other ones also. Robert Owen is going to try to create basically a communist or socialist community in America where there's no private property at all and everybody shares everything. He was an American industrialist that wanted to see if socialism or communism could work. So there will be utopian communities being created during this time. And here's an example of a Shaker meeting. Looks fun. Let's talk about the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is going to be important. It's going to lead to massive conversion. People will be born again. It's going to change church organizations in America. It'll also lead to divisions in church organizations. One of the big differences between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening is the Second Great Awakening will be tied to reform movements, and often the Second Great Awakening, some of the church leaders will also be involved in abolitionism, abolishing slavery, or temperance, or women's suffrage, or prison reform. People in the Second Great Awakening thought that their religious duties called them to change and improve America. The First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening will both widen the gaps between regions and religions. So, for example, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists and the Unitarians were mostly wealthy. They're better educated. There's not going to be a huge thing for them in the Second Great Awakening. The Baptists, the Methodists, this is more in the South and the West and parts of the countryside in the North. This is going to be where, like, the heart of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is also going to split America over slavery. This is why we have Southern Baptist and Northern Baptist. Some of the major leaders of the Second Great Awakening are Charles Finney. He was an evangelicist, preacher. He's going to denounce slavery and alcohol. He's going to offer women an active role in saving families and their husbands by making pledges and forcing their husbands to stop drinking. So even though women can't vote, they do have some kind of role in trying to reform society. Peter Cartwright was probably the greatest itinerant preacher. He also was known for wrestling for the Lord. He would fight people for Jesus. So like, John Cena, but a preacher. He was actually really skinny, so not like John Cena. Moving on. Here's a revival meeting in the Second Great Awakening. There is going to be a new religion also. This is the first religion, Christian religion made in America. This is called the Latter-day Saints or Mormonism. Joseph Smith was a farmer. Supposedly the Book of Mormon was revealed to him by the Archangel Gabriel. He's going to write the book. He's going to get people to convert and follow him. He's going to be claimed to be like the last prophet in America. The Book of Mormon was the culmination of the New Testament. A lot of people did not like Mormonism. They had some problems with it. There were some things that Mormonism did that people thought were anti-American. Like Mormons would all vote as a block, so they would all vote and vote the same way, which kind of goes against the American ideal of individual freedom. Also, Mormons practiced polygamy, where they would have many wives, and that went against American ideals, even though the Old Testament allowed for polygamy. So Joseph Smith will be murdered. He's murdered in Illinois, actually. His followers had to keep moving from Ohio to Missouri to Illinois. The next person that will become the leader of the Mormons will be Brigham Young. He'll move his followers to Utah. He had 27 wives and 56 children. He will eventually be made governor of the Utah Territory. Also, Mormons don't drink, but that's actually pretty common for Christian beliefs during this time period. Let's talk about some of the reform movements in America. The American Temperance Society will be formed by Neil Dow. He's called the father of Prohibition. He wanted to ban alcohol in America. In the late 1800s, we'll have another group being formed called the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They tried to make a law passed by the Constitution to ban alcohol. They encouraged their husbands, threatening that they won't kiss their husband unless they stop drinking. They took pledges, like where you have to pledge not to drink anymore. One of the most famous women for Prohibition was Carrie Nation, and I think I have a picture of her. This is actually a picture of a WCTU meeting. This is their sign. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Okay. And here's Carrie Nation. Carrie Nation's kind of a badass. Carrie Nation was for Prohibition, and she would go to bars, and she would have her little axe right here, and she would destroy like beer bottles, and she would destroy liquor bottles, and she would destroy casks of beer, which is kind of like, destroying private property. But super religious, super for Prohibition, and she was just known for like being a ninja and like destroying alcohol. Also during this time, women will start pushing for more equal rights. Unfortunately, women were more respected in America than they were in Europe. I don't know why that's unfortunate, but there was still not a lot going for women in America. So, for example, we have the cult of domesticity, women's places at home. Rape was a capital crime in America, where rape was only a misdemeanor in Europe. So even though women have more rights in America than Europe, it's still unfortunate because it's very little rights. So there will be some women gathering in the mid-1800s that are going to push for equal rights for women. Si se puede. Some of these women are Catherine Beecher, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the Grimke sisters, who we'll talk about next class. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were the big-time leaders. They're going to hold a female convention in Seneca Falls, New York. They're going to declare they're going to pass a declaration called the Seneca Falls. In the Seneca Falls Convention, they'll pass something called the Declaration of Sentiments. They mirror it on the Declaration of Independence, We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then they list all the bad things men have done to women throughout history. This is the first women's right convention. They're going to push for states to give women the right to vote. Some states will start to give women the right to vote as early as the 1870s, 1880s, but it's going to be a long process. But usually when you think of women women like feminist heroes, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are the two most important women in American history. Elizabeth Cady Stanton also wrote a book critiquing the Bible, how it was sexist and how it blamed women for everything. So a lot of religious people do not like her. Let's talk about some other reform during this time. There will be prison reform. Conditions in prisons and mental asylums were terrible. Many inmates were mentally handicapped. Many were debtors. A lot of times they were just chained to the wall. They were forced to do inhumane things. In like mental asylums, a lot of times, and sometimes in mental asylums, they would do lobotomies where they would cut off a part of their brain so they would become docile. And like even the prisons in general, just because you're in prison doesn't mean you should lose all your dignity. So Dorothea Dix was a New Englander. She saw how bad the prisons were. She traveled around the country examining insane asylums specifically, although some of the stuff she did is going to lead for reforms in prisons as well. She wanted to improve the conditions for insane asylums. And after her, some states will start making changes. They'll make the insane asylums more humane. There was no place for, before Dorothea Dix, there was no place for mental illness. We didn't understand the concept of mental illness. They were just in jail, chained up. They were treated terribly. People like Dorothea Dix wanted prison to become places of reform, reformatories, houses of correction, places where you could reform yourself and become better afterwards. Also during this time, William Ladd in America will create the American Peace Society to support pacifism, which never catches on. Here's my girl Dorothea Dix right here. And here's just some of the inhumane conditions in some of the mental asylums. They're just kind of chained up, can't move. They have something on their forehead. Bad times. One of the other big reform movements during this time is going to be for education. America throughout their history has a idea and a support of public education, but it was really on the state level. Remember, in the colonial America, Massachusetts passed the Old Deluders Law that provided for public education for any towns that have 50 or more people. What was happening in the 1800s, a lot of parts, and especially in the countryside, did not have schools, and Americans were not being educated. And a lot of the ideas in education is, Thomas Jefferson said this also, is you cannot have a stable democracy without an educated citizenry. I mean, look what happened. We elected Andrew Jackson. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a reform movement, specifically in the northern states, like mostly Massachusetts and New England, that's going to push for better education and better schools. This is where we're going to get the one-room schoolhouses. Horace Mann was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, and he's going to travel around on his horse all through Massachusetts. He's going to visit all the schools. He's going to write a report about how poor the schools are. And because of his report, Massachusetts is going to start to do reform, and they're going to start to do educational reform. Noah Webster is a little bit different. He creates the first American dictionary. This is considered very much like an intellectual declaration of independence for America. We're no longer relying on the British dictionary, which spells words funny like color, C-O-L-O-U-R. This is the first American dictionary. It even has some American slang that's not known of in Europe, and really is like the intellectual forerunning of America. William McGuffey is going to create the McGuffey Reader. The McGuffey Reader is the grade school readers. This is the book that you would read, like the textbook you would read in primary school to like learn how to become literate and to learn how to read. The McGuffey Reader was super patriotic. It very much affirmed, it's 1800s, but it very much affirmed to like racism and like sexism. But this is going to be the book. The McGuffey Reader is like the big book that school children use throughout America throughout most of the 1800s. There will be female seminaries in America. We have Oberlin College, Mount Holyoke Seminary and female schools. So some women in America will be able to get education. This is the one-room schoolhouse right here. Looks fun, guys. This is actually from the McGuffey Reader. Here is John. There are Anne and Jane. Anne has a new book. It is the first book. Anne must keep it nice and clean. So you can see right here, Anne's a girl. She needs to keep it nice and clean, very much affirming the gender stereotypes. Lastly, we have some changes in American art and literature during this time. There's going to be a movement in painting for two things. A lot of the painters in the 17 and 1800s will be focusing on portraits. A lot of times it's on the founding fathers. It's going to be led by people like Charles Washington Peale, Gilbert Stuart, John Trumbull, and John Singleton Copley. There's also a new landscape art movement in America called the Hudson River Valley Art. The Hudson River Valley Art movement was led by Thomas Cole. It's going to be focusing on landscapes, so American scenery and American wilderness. It's going to be very romanticized. It kind of coincides with the Romantic movement in America. So like in the real world, you might see like, if I go out to nature, I might see like some bear poo because, bears go to the bathroom. But like the Hudson River Valley art was very much like, idealized. You don't see any dead animals. You don't see anything. It's all very like pristine, very beautiful. The Hudson River Valley art also uses dramatic use of light and shadow to show sunsets and mist. Some of the other famous artists were Albert Bierstadt and Frederick Edwin Church. Let's first look at some of the portraits. Here are some of the portraits by Peale of Washington, by Stuart of Washington. That one's a little bit more famous. By Stuart again of Washington. Here, John Trumbull. This is of the Constitutional Convention by John Trumbull. John Singleton Copley, that's of Sam Adams. Now we're going to look at some of the Hudson River Valley art. As you can see here, you have like the contrast between the light. It shows like the sun. It's all very romanticized. Nature looks very beautiful. That's how you really know it's the MO for Hudson River Valley art. Another example right here, you see the sun shining right here, Hudson River Valley art. Nature. Another one right here. This one's kind of interesting. You see the contrast between the mist and the light. Another one right here. Another one. A lot of times they would paint like American like nature reserves, areas of America that were known for their beauty, like Yosemite right here is known for its beauty. It's a national park right now. Another one. This is in the Andes, so it's in South America. This one, I really like this one, even though it's just of icebergs. I just think it's kind of cool. Lastly, let's talk about what's going on in literature. There will be a revolution in American literature in the 1800s. Probably the most important American poet, writer, and you didn't know it, was Edgar Allan Poe. He's going to adopt a form of Gothic literature, which is a little bit scarier, a little bit this is scary. One of his most famous poems is The Raven. You have Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter. Herman Melville, who read Moby Dick, which is actually a really good book. You have some of the first American historians in the 1800s. You have George Bancroft, William Prescott, who's like one of the first Western historians, Washington Irving, who did Rip Van Winkle and Sleepy Hollow, James Fenimore Cooper, who did Last of the Mohicans. Walt Whitman is going to be a famous American poet. He focused on naturalistic poetry. His big book on poetry is called Leaves of Grass. There's also a new intellectual movement in America during this time called Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism was made up of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Transcendentalism will be a New England philosophical movement led by Emerson and Thoreau. It's going to focus on, it's not super organized, but it believed that there's an essential unity in the whole universe, that people are naturally good, so it's very much anti-Puritan, and that the way to really experience the world is through insight over logic. It's very much tied to like the whole Romanticism. So like people are good, insight over logic, and like we're all essentially united. Some of the famous books of transcendentalism were Thoreau wrote Walden. And Walden is really a book about how Thoreau builds a little cabin outside in the middle of the nowhere, and he just lives one with nature. Thoreau also wrote an essay because he refused to pay taxes for the Mexican-American War because he thought it supported slavery, and he argued for nonviolent civil disobedience. And one of the people that's going to be very interested by Thoreau's idea of nonviolent civil disobedience is Martin Luther King Jr. That's in another 100 years. Emerson also wrote Self-Reliance. Some last authors during this time, you have Wadsworth Longfellow, famous poet. Louisa May Alcott, she wrote Little Women, which I actually like a lot. Emily Dickinson, she's pretty good. We have a lot of like American governmental documents being published during this time, and they become like, necessities in school, and they become like part of the core curriculum, like the Federalist Papers, like Common Sense by Thomas Paine, like Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And here's Edgar Allan Poe. Man. What an interesting looking person. All right, kiddos. That's all I have for you for today. Until next time. Deuces. Deuces, yeah.